He grabbed her waist firmly, pulling her close to himself. Don't resist me. This is a way of releasing God's blessing over your life, Daddy Possibility said to Deborah during a special prayer. I've always believed in praying to God myself, but my mother thought differently. To her, Pastor Benjamin, aka Daddy Possibilities, was the voice of God on earth. She trusted him completely, dragging me to his church for prayers and prophecies. When I told her I wanted to pray on my own, she called me stubborn and insisted I meet him for a special prayer. I didn't want to, but I obeyed her. That day, everything changed. This is a story of many young girls. House of Eternal Possibilities. Church of God stood tall. It wasn't just a place of worship. It was a landmark. Crowds filled the pews every Sunday, eager to catch a glimpse of Daddy Possibilities, Pastor Benjamin Adera. He was no ordinary preacher. With his designer suits, polished shoes, and a convoy of luxury cars, he was as much a celebrity as a man of God. Women adored him, calling him Daddy with reverence. They whispered about his anointing, giving him more respect than they gave their husbands. Men too bowed to him, seeking his guidance for their businesses and families. Pastor Benjamin had a reputation for solving problems, especially for those who could pay the price. The church auditorium buzzed with excitement as the choir belted out powerful tunes. Daddy Possibilities walked in, his presence commanding attention. He mounted the altar, gripping the microphone tightly. Today, he announced, God is about to do something miraculous. Your lives will never remain the same. The congregation erupted in cheers. The congregation at House of Eternal Possibilities was as lively as ever. The choir had just finished their electrifying ministration when Mrs. Rachel approached Daddy Possibilities after the service. Her teenage daughter, Deborah, stood by her side, clutching her handbag nervously. Daddy, please, I need you to pray for my daughter, Mrs. Rachel began. She has just finished her wake and is trusting God for admission into the university. Possibility smiled warmly, his charismatic demeanor drawing them in. Ah, my daughter, he said, turning to Deborah. God has great plans for you. Come forward. Deborah stepped forward hesitantly. Daddy Possibilities placed his hand on her head, muttering a string of prayers. After the prayer, Daddy Possibilities straightened up and spoke directly to Deborah. Come back later, my daughter. There's a special prayer I need to do for your breakthrough. God is about to open doors for you. Mrs. Rachel beamed with gratitude. Thank you, Daddy. We will be here. That evening at home, Deborah sat quietly in the corner of the living room while her mother prepared dinner. The events of the day weighed heavily on her mind. Mommy, she began hesitantly, I don't think I need to go back to Daddy Possibilities for the prayer. I want to pray on my own. God will still hear me. Mrs. Rachel stopped chopping vegetables and turned to face her daughter, her expression stern. What nonsense are you saying, Deborah? Do you think you know God better than Daddy Possibilities? He's a man of God. His prayers work faster and more efficiently. But Mom, Deborah tried to explain, I believe God will hear me if I pray sincerely from my heart. Mrs. Rachel waved her hand dismissively. You're just being stubborn. You teenagers think you know everything. Tomorrow you will go back to Daddy Possibilities for the prayer, and that's final. Deborah sighed, knowing there was no point arguing further. She quietly returned to her room, her heart heavy with unease. The next day, Deborah returned to the church as instructed by her mother. She was greeted by one of the ushers, who led her to Daddy Possibilities' office. Ah, my daughter, welcome, Daddy Possibility said, rising from his plush chair. His smile was wide, but there was something unsettling in his gaze that Deborah couldn't quite place. Sit down, he said, motioning to the chair opposite him. Deborah sat nervously, clutching her bag tightly. God revealed something to me about you, Daddy Possibilities began. Your destiny is very bright, but there are forces trying to stop you. That's why I need to pray for you in a special way. Deborah nodded, unsure of what to say. Come closer, he instructed. Hesitantly, Deborah stood and moved closer to his desk. What happened next would change her life forever. Daddy Possibility's demeanor shifted. His voice, once soothing, became demanding. He reached for her, and before Deborah could comprehend what was happening, he had his way with her. When it was over, he adjusted his tie, his expression calm as though nothing had happened. Deborah, on the other hand, was shaking. tears streaming down her face. Listen to me, Daddy Possibilities said firmly. You must never tell anyone about this. If you do, you will bring a curse upon yourself and your family. Do you understand? Deborah nodded numbly, her voice caught in her throat. She stumbled out of the office, her mind spinning. When Deborah returned home, she was a shadow of herself. Her mother noticed her silence but dismissed it as teenage moodiness. Deborah, how was the prayer session? Mrs. Rachel asked casually while peeling yams. Deborah hesitated, her lips trembling. Mama, something happened. Mrs. Rachel glanced at her daughter briefly. What happened? Speak up. Deborah tried to find the words. Mama, I don't think Daddy Possibilities is what he seems. Before she could finish, Mrs. Rachel slammed her knife on the cutting board. Deborah, what are you trying to say? That a whole man of God is not genuine? Are you trying to bring a curse upon this house? Mama, please, just listen to me, Deborah pleaded. He did something to me. Keep quiet, her mother shouted, her voice laced with anger. I don't want to hear any more of this nonsense. You just don't like church. That's why you're saying all these things. You're too young to understand spiritual matters. Go to your room and stop nagging me. Deborah's heart sank. She wanted to scream, to cry, to make her mother see the truth. But Mrs. Rachel had already dismissed her, focusing again on her cooking. During the service the next Sunday, Pastor Benjamin's prophetic powers were on full display. He scanned the crowd as though searching for someone. Suddenly, his eyes settled on a young woman sitting quietly in the middle row. You, the sister in the yellow dress, stand up. The woman, visibly nervous, rose to her feet. Yes, Daddy, what's your name? My name is Taupe, sir, she replied, her voice trembling. Taupe, Daddy Possibilities began. The Lord is showing me something about your life. You've been struggling with relationships? Am I correct? Taupe's eyes widened in shock. Yes, Daddy, it's true. You've been praying for a husband, but nothing is working. Am I speaking the truth? Yes, Daddy, it's true. Taupe's voice cracked as tears streamed down her face. Taupe walked to the altar, where Daddy Possibilities laid his hand on her head. I break every yoke of delay in your life. Your husband will find you. After this service, come and see me in my office. There is a special prayer I need to do for you. The congregation erupted in applause as Taupe knelt down, overwhelmed. Later in the service, Daddy Possibilities turned his attention to a sophisticated-looking woman seated at the front. She was Mrs. Adola, the wife of a successful businessman. She was known for her wealth, always dressed in the finest attire. You, my daughter, Mrs. Adola, stand up. She rose gracefully, a curious smile on her face. Yes, Daddy. The Lord is revealing something to me about your marriage, Daddy Possibility said, his tone grave. There is trouble in your home. Your husband has not been faithful. Mrs. Adela's expression shifted, her smile fading. Daddy, is that true? She asked, her voice shaking. Yes, my daughter, Daddy Possibilities replied. But don't worry. God will fight for you. After the service, come to my office for counseling. The congregation murmured, impressed by Daddy Possibilities' ability to see what others could not. After the service, a line of people formed outside Daddy Possibilities' lavish office. The room was decorated with gold-plated furniture and framed photographs of him with dignitaries. Taupe was the first to be called in. She sat nervously across from him, clutching her handbag. My daughter, Daddy Possibilities began, you are special. That is why the enemy has been fighting your relationships. But don't worry, I will personally pray for you. Sow a seed of faith, and your breakthrough will come. Thank you, Daddy, Taupe said, reaching into her bag to hand over an envelope of cash.